Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Neutrality Studies. My name is Pascal Lotta. I'm an associate professor at Kyoto University, and I'm joined today by two non-conformist thinkers. I've got with me Peter Lavelle and Dr. John Laughland. Peter, John, thanks very much for joining me.
Thanks for
It's
having me.
wonderful to be. Pascal, you're doing excellent work. I'm
You
very
certainly are.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it for both of you. I mean, you've been in this game for quite a long time, and you were kind enough to invite me also to your show several times. And Peter, you you've got a lot of shows on the traditional media, on podcasts, and so on. Can you both tell me a little bit about what got you into the podcasting space coming also from academia, coming from journalism and authoring books. Maybe let's start with Peter and then we go to John.
well. I'm a refugee from academia. I'm still recovering. It's been decades, but still. When I left academia in the late '90s, I went into first into consumer research. Believe it or not, everyone, I was doing consumer research on toothpaste and toothbrushes and shampoo, and Colgate Palmolive. Remarkably, not in America, but in Poland, because I'd been off the end of a 2-year Fulbright. I knew full well I wasn't going to stay in academia, but I took advantage of the 2 years to do what I wanted to do. Then went into the business sphere, and then I moved from there into finance, financial editing. Within 6 months, I became a financial analyst, and a few months after that, I was a deputy department of capital markets in a multinational firm in Warsaw. Everybody, it doesn't take much to become a financial analyst, okay? And it's not very hard. And for those of you that you have a choice between academia and finance, go to finance, make some money, and then retire and write books and do podcasts. And then an opportunity in 1998 appeared to do financial research, consumer research in Russia. And I worked at Alpha Bank for a while. And then I hated it the whole time. I don't like finance. A lot of finance is really dishonest, very, and it's engineered that way. It's all insider stuff. It's all insider stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
And, but, being in academia for 10 years and poor, going into finance, and all of a sudden you're going to pay me this to do that? Sure. Financial crisis comes, 1998. I get paid off, which is a rarity in Russia. I was paid off to leave. And then I just went into writing op-eds. I was still in good graces with the normative media world, wrote for the Moscow Times, for example. And that kind of just rolled into writing for a lot of people, the United Press International. I don't know if it still exists. And then finally, people started paying me. And then, everybody knows RT came around, and the rest is history.
And John, what was your journey into this world?
Well, I like your expression, Pascal, non-conformist thinker, because to me that's a pleonasm. If you're a thinker, you're going to be non-conformist, and the conformists are precisely those people who don't think, but instead who navigate according to criteria other than thought, most notably self-interest, and also, I would say, cowardice. Lots of people, I think, navigate according to what they think their colleagues and friends and so on would like to hear, and that's the most common. It's a very common human trait, the herd instinct, and many great academics. I'm a great reader of the French anthropologist René Girard, who writes a lot about this and about crowds, and indeed I've taught courses on the psychology of crowds and including virtual crowds and so on. But my path is the opposite from Peter's, because I am indeed now a full-time academic. Having not been until about 3 or 4 years ago. I teach in a private university in the west of France. I also teach in Paris, where I live. But my trajectory came really from in the 90s. I was working a lot. I worked then for as I was still writing my doctoral thesis, I worked for a Conservative member of Parliament in Britain who was campaigning against the Maastricht Treaty from the Conservative backbenches. This was a famous episode the Maastricht rebels who rebelled against John Major and who, of course, were supportive of Mrs. Thatcher before she was overthrown in November 1990. And so during the 90s, I did a lot of work, including writing books on sovereignty, on the European question generally, but particularly on sovereignty. What is sovereignty? What is statehood? And so on. And then when NATO attacked Yugoslavia in 1999, that was, I suppose, my awakening, because like many British conservatives, I'd been sort of unthinking Atlanticist, and yet here was NATO, obviously, not only violating international law, committing war of aggression, but above all, doing so in the name of human rights. And as it happened, I'd started to get an interest in human rights, and I was, as you might imagine, very critical of them as a concept and as a practice. And then in the 2000s, after that, I did a lot of work in post-communist Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. I was always very interested in Russia and the Soviet Union, and traveled behind the Iron Curtain several times before it fell, including to the Soviet Union. And so I had an interest in that area, and of course in the phenomenon of communism and post-communism. And I suppose I observed really how the Kosovo War being, as I've often called it, a war of the new left against the old left, certain aspects of Marxism, of Ur-Marxismus, migrated back from where they had been lodged for several decades, back to their region of origin, which was, of course, Western Europe, German expatriates in the British Library. And what I mean by that is that the West, of course, at that stage became globalist and post-national, post-modern, internationalist, and all the rest of it. And then,
well, it's interesting, John, that you say that, because maybe my epiphany, I lived in Poland for 10 years, and a good part of it was during the communist era. And so there was a lot of affirmation. I knew many people in the Solidarity movement. And so they embrace, he's an American, he must be on our side. And I actually went along with that for a long time. I mean, because it was the good guy, bad guy. I was very simple. I had been educated at the University of California when it came to economics, when it came to geography, when it came to politics, international relations. They were all Eastern European emigres, all to the person. And so, Peter, we know the Russians. We will tell you about the Russians. And so I pretty much imbibed that. I didn't really question it very much. And when you're a young person, when you're like 20, 21, 22, and you have this cause like, Solidarność, it was invigorating, because it was something unique. It was something like nobody else that I know was experiencing this. It was really kind of a useful exercise in like experiencing the world. But my epiphany was when I moved to Russia. I wanted to make money.
So 98, you moved in 98, right?
I just wanted to make maybe I'll stay here a couple of years, stuff my pockets. And I remember I was staying in the National Hotel right across the street from the Kremlin. And so I was picked up at the airport, put down, had something to eat, and I thought, I'm going to go take a walk. And I took a walk down Tverskaya, the main drag. And immediately, gentlemen, I did this. We were afraid of this. And, just living here, you just began to realize these people have nothing to do with the caricature that I was brought up with, and then reinforced by academia and reinforced by living in communist Europe. And so when you have that kind of break, you just suddenly realize maybe you should do some self-examination. And that's what's happened. I mean, all due respect to our academic fellow here, but basically everything I learned was wrong, incorrect, or a lie as a university student in California.
Oh, I agree with that. I think universities are terrible, by and large. Not the one I teach, but...
Hey, very brief intermission because I was recently banned from YouTube, and although I'm back, this can happen anytime again. So please consider subscribing not only here, but to my mailing list on Substack. That's pascalotta.substack.com. The link's going to be in the description below. And now back to the video. But we've got the idea of universities being this place of universal learning and openness and inquiry into reality. And then you go to the natural scientists, and you realize, they have a lot to work with, and they have these beautiful methods, including doing experiments and so on. And then you go into the humanities, or even the bigger fraud, the social sciences. Those are not sciences. This is, at best, they're studies, social studies. That would be the right description. But they then try to imitate that, and they tell you, we will now tell you what the world is about, the real world. And then you've got people who have never visited Russia and so on, and will tell you all about it. And you cannot actually have, at least in Europe at the moment, I get a lot of emails these days from people who study Russia or the Slavic world more generally, and they are afraid. They're scared to actually say stuff that might get them kicked out of university. And this is coming from the Free West. And I had, at the beginning, when this happened, and I got contacted, I was like, oh, this must be new. And then I started talking to people and realized, oh no, wait a second, the West never was that beacon.
It never was that. Excellent point. It never was.
How come that it is so easy for how is it so easy to fool people into believing they live in a world that, once you start testing the principles, once you start testing the values, they're not like that? What's your conclusion at this point of your life, having experienced all of this?
You go first, John. Go ahead, Joe.
Well, I haven't. I mean, I've experienced it, I suppose, a bit in my sort of media work, in the sense that for many decades, or 2 or 3 decades, I did used to write in the media, but that stopped quite a long time ago. And at the time when I was doing it, I didn't really suffer from it. I mean, for instance, being a Eurosceptic in Britain was not,
Sure.
there were plenty of other people doing the same thing.
Right.
The Russia thing, of course, is very problematic, but indeed, I think it's not a coincidence that I no longer have any presence in the Russian, in the British media. By the way, George Galloway made this point recently. George Galloway, the former member of Parliament, who was, as I was, detained at a British airport, Gatwick. We were both detained at Gatwick under absolutely disgraceful counter-terrorism legislation. And he was detained for 6 hours and made a big stink about it. And in one of the video pieces that he did after this, he said, in the run-up to the Iraq War, so that's 2003, he says, I was a vocal opponent. I was on the television every single night arguing against the Iraq War. And he said, I have not, this was speaking, I think, last year, late last year, he said, I have not been invited on the BBC for more than 10 years. This is a man who is a National Party leader, quite a well-known politician, and so on. So there's been a decline. There's no doubt there's been a decline. I mean, I'm lucky enough not to observe it in the university context, because I work in a very special private university that luckily does have academic freedom. But of course, I'm aware of it from the outside. And I'm afraid I think the explanation is very straightforward. First of all, it's the herd mentality that I mentioned. People feel under pressure, and may indeed be under pressure, to conform. And people, by and large, human beings by and large, don't like not to conform. Matthias Desmet makes this point in the Psychology of Totalitarianism. He says there are basically 3/3 of people. There are, there's 1/3 who will just drift along, there's 1/3 who will be actively in favor, and there's 1/3 who will be against. So I think 1/3 is probably rather a large estimate for the number of people who are against, but whatever. So obviously there's that psychological, anthropological element. But the other explanation is very straightforward, is that the universities are dependent, of course, largely on public money. And in order to get research grants and so on, I mean, you know this perfectly well, Pascal, you have to go through a bureaucratic process, which ultimately is in the hands of the state. And there's no value put, I would say, on it. And independently of the sort of conspiratorial side of this, I mean, I was at the University of Oxford in the 1980s, and I have to say that even then, I found it intellectually very, very, very backward and very uninteresting. And I remember somebody saying to me at the time, you don't have to be an academic in order to think. And I think whoever made that remark to me, no doubt encouraged me to not be an academic, as I wasn't for most of my career.
My lived experience, instead of going through the humiliation of trying to get grants and all of that. And plus, you have to check the boxes. You know what I mean? They're looking to get elected. Okay, I think everyone got my point here. I didn't fit that profile, and I'm not
Yeah.
complaining. I'm just observing as a fact. Okay,
Yeah.
and so I mean the that's one of the things I've learned in this space is that I don't have to be in the ivory tower to talk to people in the ivory
Yeah.
tower.
Exactly.
It's a shortcut, and I love it. I mean, being being shunned. Um, I had Stephen Cohen on a number of times on my program, and it was always a delight. And particularly when he would come to Moscow with his wife, we would go out to dinner and spend a lot of time together. What an amazing person! We miss him so
Yeah.
much. But
Yeah.
I had him on with John Mearsheimer, and Mearsheimer, this is like 10 years ago, and Mearsheimer is saying, I haven't been on television in years. And
Yeah.
look what's happened now. Oh, he's
Mhm.
ubiquitous. I mean, he's so ubiquitous, people are copying him.
Yeah.
He's having to chase down all of these fakes. But, John, one of the things that's really interesting, if we look at particularly like Russia or even China, I would say, when we were coming up, it was the traditional left and right divide. Okay.
Yeah.
And, for all the criticism of the Frankfurt School, I actually liked reading it. I thought it was very stimulating. It was very different from what the other paradigms. I don't think it's a good idea to embrace it as a user's manual, but there's that, but that was the axis here. But what happens when you have a country like Russia and China that are largely not ideological anymore? And and
Yes.
how do you critique it? Okay, and then Russia is a fundamentally very conservative country, so you can't say those communists, and people still slip up. All the Soviets, I mean Russians, they still say that all of the time. And so critiquing a country like Russia in a normative sense became very, very difficult. So it's just, they're just barbarians, and they're the antithesis of us, which is such a juvenile critique. I mean, you don't learn anything from it. So, the kind of very stale tools of analyzing international relations became dysfunctional, and then it just became absurd. And then you throw into the fact, we know a number of people, I won't mention them, the academics or people quasi-academic, they say, sorry, I can't come on, it's a little too sensitive
Yeah.
right now. And I perfectly understand. I mean, it's people in the West that are courageous to stand up for free speech. I'm not a hero for doing it because I don't have there's no repercussions for me. Okay. But this is the fundamental change. And the genuine fear people have. I mean, there's some, again, I don't want to name names, but there's some people in the podcast space that I watch very regularly, and I have contact with them all the time, and they just say it's not a good time, it's just not a good time. Okay,
Yeah, but
it's
it's like, it's this environment that's being created, right? And Russia today, to me, is an important source to actually read in order to understand how, well, from a Russian side of things, you would write about stuff in the English language. I mean, what would this medium want to say? So it's
Well, Pascal, one of the positive, it's almost kind of like a ricochet. When it comes to RT's website, it is infinitely much better now than it was a few years ago because they're providing that service, the economy, society, what's popular and popular culture and things like that. Before they wanted to be like everybody else. Okay. And why go to a imitation when you can go to the original? Okay. And so when you have a unique message, then it is very attractive. And I think that's one of and I compliment the people that work on the website.
Where do you think this idea came from that we cannot study this anymore? And Jacques Beau made this point a lot that back in the Cold War, the West was not afraid of the propaganda
Exactly.
of the East.
Yeah.
You could read all of these newspapers. They were being imported. There was no scare that this would suddenly sway the entirety of Western Europe to become communist. But now the idea of the European Union is if you access RT or you talk to people on RT, then you yourself are an agent and you're trying to transform them. You're doing mind control, and you're a part of the cognitive warfare of the others. When we perfectly know that NATO is studying cognitive warfare and how to use it against the Russians and against the Europeans, right? So I mean, it's just so bizarre. It's such a bizarre moment, and
Well,
I 10 years ago, if you told me this 10 years ago, that this is what it will come to, I would have told you, no. I mean, I know it's maybe not perfect, but it will never go.
Well, Pascal, you asked why. I mean, because people like Kaya Kallas and von der Leyen are in power. I mean, people of very limited intelligence and creativity, because the arguments they make are so flaccid. They're literally laughable. Okay, and so the reason why is they don't have a strong argument. It's as simple as that.
John,
you mentioned 10 years ago, Pascal. You said I wouldn't have believed this 10 years ago, and I think 10 years ago is about right. I think a lot of the trends that have now reached a very severe degree, a very dangerous degree, did indeed start 10 years ago, 2016, when the 2016 being, of course, the year when Trump was first elected and the year of the Brexit referendum. And I mean, I believe, I mentioned it briefly earlier, it's a big subject, but I do very firmly believe, and I've written a lot about this, that there has been a sort of translatio imperii of Marxism from Soviet Russia back to Europe. I do believe that. And Vladimir Bukovsky said, I've lived through your future, a Soviet dissident living in Europe. And many of the things that Solzhenitsyn wrote in the 1970s, we can recognize them, obviously, in Europe today. So my personal position is I am often framed, indeed, as someone who's close to or interested in Russia. I'm not. I have no expertise on Russia at all, except from having been interested in the country for a long time. Instead, what I think of myself as being is a critic and an analyst and a critic of Western policy, of American, particularly American, and of course also European policy. That's what I do, and what I think I'm good at is identifying. And again, this is what I think that Peter said it just now, or perhaps it was you, Pascal. This notion of narrative control. We live, just as the Soviets did, in profoundly ideological societies. The ideology actually is probably stronger now than it was in the Soviet period, because it tapered off, I think, probably after Khrushchev, or maybe possibly even after Stalin, I don't know, under Stalin. But it tapered off, whereas in Western Europe, the ideology is absolutely all-encompassing. And it's so all-encompassing, not only does it have the anthropological effects I referred to earlier, but it means that, and Peter and I have discussed this on our podcast, that to me, a very large percentage, if not the totality of government activity in Western Europe now, is devoted to narrative control. That really is what they do. They don't do anything else. They don't run state finances correctly. They don't build up their militaries to prepare for conflict. They don't protect their populations with proper police forces. They don't obviously protect them against immigration. They don't repair the streets. They don't do any of the functions of a sort of in the real world. Peter, you said you started off selling toothpaste. They don't do anything in the real world. Instead, it is all about narrative control. And that, of course, is precisely what makes us in Europe so Soviet at the moment.
Well, but see, this is the point, and John is absolutely right. Everything I do in the podcast space and in my program, I'm not propagating anything. I'm critiquing. I'm just critiquing Western narratives. That's all I do. If you want to distill it down, that's what I do. Because when RT was started, we wanted to explain Russia to the world, and I just said that's almost an impossible thing, because television is linear. You can't stop and, like reading a book. You read this, what does that mean? Let me go back to the beginning. You can't do it, okay? So I would need to do a mini documentary on a topic before I would be able to have a discussion on the topic. And so it was just a fool's errand at the end of the day, because it was just too hard. The attitudes and lack of knowledge about Russia is so insurmountable. You have to make an effort, okay? And so I decided, no. I mean, if the critique, I would critique the critique of Russia. That's what I do. That's what I do almost all the time, because I would love to have all three of us, maybe throw in George Samueli and Mark Sloboda, and do a weekly 2-hour roundtable over certain topics. Okay, was the revolution a success? Because, and then then people can learn from it. But if I just go, it was a success, And what is your bearings? What do you mean? What do you mean by success? Okay. And of course, if we had a panel like that, John would say, well, Peter, of course, what does it mean to be success? Okay. And so I agree with John. I mean, it's, they have no new idea, something about in the West, and they are terrified of losing power. And we have these things called elections. No, they're mini referendums. You're not given a choice. You're asked over and over again, through bells and whistles, to reaffirm the status quo. That's all elections do now in the West.
In Switzerland, we run this experiment for the last 130 years with direct democracy, and you see quite often that the voting population doesn't actually vote the way that the government or parliament are suggesting. Although not always. I mean, there's a good moment when there is a lot of alignment, but even just having the choice of saying no to certain policies is already quite something. But even so, in Switzerland, although I would say the temperature boils on a lower degree, it still does boil to a good extent. And if I compare that to Japan, the Japanese have similar speech acts, but they don't have this same attitude toward Russia. And I would really say they don't have Russophobia. They do not hate it. In my institute, 1.5 years ago, they hired a Russian researcher from Moscow because she's good. So they hired her. That 1.5 years ago, and that I think in the context of Europe, that's almost unthinkable.
Well, I think that's because Russophobia is a particular European phenomenon, which
It's very British.
which says more about Europe than it says about Russia. It is
It's
simply
very
that,
British.
yeah, Europe there's a long history of it. There are books about it. One of your compatriots, Pascal, wrote, is it Guy Metton? I think he wrote quite a good book about it. There's an Italian book about it. There are plenty of books about it. And as far as I recall, what they all say is that it's part of Europe's self-image, Western Europe's self-image.
Exactly.
So this whole thing of obviously Russia being backward and barbaric and,
but John,
behind and so on, we are more progressive. It's all part of Western European progressivism, which ultimately, I give courses on progressivism, started in the 17th century. And that is, of course, as it happens, the time when Russia, as we know, Peter the Great went to the Netherlands and so on. And that image of Russia being behind, well, everyone was behind the Netherlands, I think, in the 17th century. The entire world was behind, if such words in front and behind have any meaning. But now, of course, it's become even more pronounced than before, because in the European context, in the European Union, we are post-national, we are post-Christian, we are post-historical. We've turned our back on our own history. We don't, never again, nie wieder Krieg and so on. We have moved into a sort of postmodern politics, and the image of Russia, which is built up as the negative image, is of a country that is nationalist and Christian and reactionary and based, authoritarian and all the rest of it. And that's the psychological function which Russophobia.
Yeah, but with the Russophobia is also a mechanism to impugn all negative attributes onto other, which those negative attributes are very much part of the Europeans' experience. Okay, exploitation, for example, imperialism, colonialism, and all of that. And John listed a number of things, but Christian, conservative, respect for history, respect for the older generation. I kind of like those things. So, okay, call me a reactionary, if you will. Okay. No, it's really interesting. Is, you have the same kind of Cold War dynamic. There was ideology then, but now it's culture and civilization that has replaced it. Okay. And it's a huge leap to go in. I mean, the West, particularly the United States, has done this to Iran since 1979. What do people know about Iran that are born after that? If you don't make an effort, you're going to know the mainstream narrative. And so, and that's why people that give critique, a lot of people that talk about Russia on these podcasts that we all know, some of them are pretty pro-Russia, but most of them are pretty neutral, it seems to me. If they see something they don't like, they just say it. I mean, without fear or favor. Okay. I mean, and just saying, being dispassionate. You have to be passionate. You can't be dispassionate. There's something wrong with that.
But we're gonna have a referendum in Switzerland, either fall this year or spring next year. This stuff always takes very long, about writing a proper definition of neutrality into our constitution, because at the moment the constitution mentions it but doesn't define it. And this particular proposal says, like, okay, no, we need to understand neutrality also in the economic realm, so no sanctions if possible. There's risks there, but it really wants to change this. The party that I am part of, I'm a paying member of the Social Democrats. They're fighting against that, and they're fighting it by calling it a pro-Putin initiative. And it's so infantile. I wonder where this comes from, but it exemplifies this point that one part of the European establishment, or the European thinkers, I mean, on the other side, they just frame everything that is not pro NATO automatically as pro-Russian. There's no more space in between, and this is something that bothers me so bad, because the whole idea of neutrality is to be friends with everybody, be friends with the Russians, with the Americans, with the Europeans, with the Chinese, with the Japanese. But there's something that constantly pushes European elites into this camp and block thinking, and it strikes me as infantile. But I don't know how you look at that. Maybe let's
Yeah, but how much pressure is Switzerland? How much pressure from outside Switzerland to vote in the direction of if you take accepting a anti-Russia position? I mean, when people always mention Switzerland, which is a wonderful country, but it's always an exception, and for so many reasons. But I mean, is there pressure from the EU, from NATO? I mean, Switzerland is not members of either.
No, I'm sure.
but the pressure is great, and the pressure also comes from within. I mean, for the last 4 years, they've been publishing white paper after white paper that says, like, we are neutral, but we are going to practice integration with NATO.
Yeah, but this has been going on for a long time. Yeah.
And it's the same in Ireland. It's the same in Austria. It's the mind
Austria.
capture. It's this mind capture that happened also to the Germans and the French, that also took the other neutrals, and it's basically thinking of security within solemnly within this mindset of the West, and this idea of deterrence. We have to deter the Russians.
Again, Pascal, you've raised this on your own podcast. I can't remember her name, but that young German girl with her first name.
Nell Bonilla.
What?
Nell Bonilla.
Yeah,
Nell Bonilla.
that's right. You did a podcast on the security state, and this is something that I feel very strongly about as well. And she makes this point very well. And then you and I had an email exchange about it. We discovered, the party I work for in the Netherlands discovered that the NATO member states are subject to certain secret NATO objectives. This slipped out. A Dutch minister, the Minister of Health, as it happens, said she couldn't do this or that policy because of these NATO objectives. And one of our MPs put down questions to the Dutch government and got answers. And it was said quite openly in written answers, which we've published, that these objectives are secret, but they are obligatory. These obligations, sorry, not objectives, obligations. And this is part of the bigger picture, which you discussed with Nell, of the security state, the way that everything now, all kinds of issues, never mind Russia, but we saw it also with COVID. These issues are brought under the remit of security threats. And when I say under the remit, the example I quote very often, again from 2016, is a debate in the European Parliament about strategic communication, where the Commission was represented not by the Directorate General for Communication, the part of the Commission that's supposed to basically do propaganda for the Commission. No, the Commissioner who spoke spoke for the Commission on this issue of strategic communication was the Commissioner for Security. In other words, the person who was supposed to deal with basically defense and security policy, secret services, and so on. And this was a very emblematic example, but there are many others, of how the security services, so either the intelligence services or the armed forces, are upstream of politics. And they are the people, that's what your podcast showed so well with Nell, that the security state has become so embedded in Western societies that it is essentially running the show. And yet again, this of course is an aspect of our Sovietization, because everybody knows the KGB and the Securitate and the Stasi and all those all those secret services had the word security in their name. That's what they were doing.
Well, I mean, if Europe needs deterrence, it needs deterrence from the in light of the United States, which is verboten to talk about. Why can't you talk about that? I mean, there is a mountain of evidence about energy security, dependence on the United States, very expensive. The British, I think, very foolishly getting into attacking the shadow fleet. Controlling energy supply lines and whatnot. I mean, how much more imprisonment do you want? I mean, I find it really extraordinary. And these things are written in the mainstream media,
Well,
but you know
again,
what? Maybe it's a bad idea.
it's a psychological problem. It doesn't have a name as far as I know in psychology, but it's very well described in a wonderful poem by a Swiss author, Max Frisch's Biedermann und die Brandstifter, Biedermann and the Fire Raisers, a play which tells the story of a man who lets rooms in his house. Biedermann is a very goody-goody, as the name suggests, a goody-goody man, rather small-minded, petit bourgeois. And he lets rooms in his house to people who, as the audience very quickly understands, are arsonists. They are the fire raisers, and they're going around and setting light to buildings in the city. And he, of course, refuses to believe the evidence in front of his eyes. And the play, which is a wonderful sort of psychodrama, ends with one of these arsonists coming down from his room where he rents upstairs and asking Herr Biedermann if he can have a match. And Biedermann gives him the match and then turns to his wife and says, "But Anna, if they were terrorists, they would have their own matches." So this is basically Lenin saying, the capitalists will sell us the rope with which we will hang them. Europe clearly is the theater, one of the theaters, the main theater of an energy war between the United States and Russia, which began about 20 years ago when America discovered fracking and therefore became a very big exporter of gas. And Europe is a natural market. And yet we in Europe, our European leaders, are indeed in a Biedermann-style situation where we have got ourselves caught, and the truth, if it were ever to be revealed, is just too difficult to bear. Humankind cannot bear too much reality.
But it hurts, because it hurts, doesn't it? I mean, if you have to come to that realization, it really takes time. I can't forget this moment, when the special military operation, the full scale war, started in February 4 years ago, right? And I was devastated. And I know, Peter, you predicted it. I always thought this people will calm down again. And I thought so because I knew what the solution was. The solution was for Ukraine to go back to neutrality, because neutrality would fulfill everybody's security needs. It's the obvious choice. And when it didn't happen, I was so devastated that I thought, like, I need to figure out why it didn't happen. And I wrote even Mr. Trenin, Dmitry Trenin, saying, like, can we talk again? And can you explain why you think from a Russian perspective neutrality failed? And he just wrote back and said, like, look, this is something for the West to figure out by themselves.
Yeah.
And he's absolutely right. By now, we know exactly that was the West that undermined a win-win situation, because that's not what was wanted. It was a win-win.
Well, that's because it wanted, as General Milley, the former chief of staff of the American Armed Forces, said shortly before he left office, I've forgotten now whether it was under Trump or not, but he said, we're going to make Ukraine into Russia's Afghanistan. The goal was never to have peace. The goal was to have a war, because it was believed, and is still believed. The Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski, my old mate from Oxford, he said, we're going to fight this for 2 years more, and in 2 years the Russian economy will collapse. That is the policy. That is the policy. It is to put a festering sore on Russia's doorstep in the hope that it will weaken Russia irredeemably. So the solution was there, but it was precisely that solution that the Western powers didn't.
Well, I mean, it was patently obvious that the Minsk process was a complete fraud. It was before and Merkel admitted it publicly, but it was well known here, and there was a great deal of frustration. On top of it, and you can read in the pages of the Washington Post in December of 2021, I obviously don't remember the title, but the NATOization of Ukraine and how gleeful they were. I mean, it's in front of you. It's in front of you. The failed Minsk process, and then the NATOization, and then the very glib attitude of the Biden administration. And one of the things, and I've talked about it at the time, is people were talking about turning the ruble into rubble, and I said no. They learned from the sanctions of 2014 when it came to Crimea, and they put their minds to it. They did it in a very serious way. I wasn't, I wasn't particularly worried about being economically crushed. I was more worried about how Russians psychologically were going to be crushed, because I told them, I said, the great experiment of Peter the Great has come to an end. It came to an end in 2014. People became to realize that in 2022. But so I was psychologically braced for it. And I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I welcomed it. I didn't welcome the war. I welcomed the separation. Russia needs to be isolated from the West for a generation, because the West is going to go through its gyrations, and it's going to be messy. It's going to be very sad, maybe even violent. And I want Russia to be insulated from that. Yeah, because there's no corrective here. It has to fail. Sorry.
How is it for you as a U.S. citizen? Because in my
I'm a Russian.
yes,
I'm a Russian citizen as well.
but if you were a European citizen, then you would probably already be sanctioned. But I've got this perception that in the United States, for all it did, some of their values, they actually keep them stronger, like the freedom of speech. Like, Americans tend not to be afraid to go on Russian TV. The Europeans are. A lot of us are like very like
but
chicken and so on.
the British are afraid. The British are afraid.
Yeah,
That was one of the big changes, is that I would say a third, maybe 40% of my guests were from the UK. After the special military operation started, it went to zero. Almost.
Is it possible for you to still go back and forth and visit the United States? I mean, RT also has Mr. Sanchez, right? Former CNN reporter on RT now. I mean, how do you see that relationship, like skipping the continent?
Well, Pascal, I'm not going to test that proposition, okay? Because it's not worth it. I have a full life here. I have a family. I have property. I have assets. I have dogs. Not 1% risk for me to lose all of that. So I'm perfectly willing to wait it out. But I don't think one of the things that there's this obsession in many of these podcasts about I call it last legism. When is Ukraine finally going to collapse? And when you get into the prediction business, you end up usually with egg on your face. Okay, and I've constantly, and I think I've talked about this with John, is that even if there's a cessation of hostilities, if there is some kind of recognized status of peace, I'm not talking about a ceasefire, the the accusations of a fifth column and the pointing of fingers. How did the West fail? Oh, it was inside. Somebody sabotaged us. That's where it's going to go. Those that kept an even keel in Europe talking about the conflict, I think they will be under just as much, if not more, pressure, because there will not be amicable relations between Europe and Russia in my lifetime.
Do you think so too, John? Like,
Yes, I do. I do
bridges
think so. I
burned
think
for
it's.
50
I'm sorry?
years? Are these
I'm sorry?
bridges burned for the next 50 years?
Absolutely, yes. I think
Yeah.
it's a generational thing, without any doubt.
I agree.
And not least, by the way, because of course, as we've indirectly mentioned already, there was a huge build-up even before the invasion of Ukraine, even before 2022. Obviously the 2014 events, but the 2004 events, the Orange Revolution, and more generally, the whole constant Russophobic, anti-Putin attacks, which started from 2000 when Putin took power, and then they were in abeyance for a bit under Medvedev, but then, of course, started again very much in earnest in 2012. In other words, there's a whole atmosphere had been built up long, obviously, many, many, many years, a decade at least, before the events of 2022. And now,
Well,
of course,
John,
it's gone into violence and war. And indeed, I am convinced that it will now be
I
over for a very, very, very long time until there is some major institutional, cultural, and philosophical change in Europe.
in your John, I pinpoint the change in the Yukos affair. If you look at the
Yes,
pieces,
exactly,
the
exactly.
the
Yeah,
Financial Times,
yeah,
that's when they really started.
yeah,
Well, went back to their old habits.
yeah.
But Pascal, but John and I are in agreement that an amicable relationship between Russia and Ukraine is not in the cards for a very long time. But this is a remarkable mental change in Russia. People don't expect it now. They've moved on. They have moved on, and the worshiping of the West, which I always, shook my head about living here, um, that is dissipated.
Yeah,
As a matter of fact, it has been translated into pride.
yeah, yeah.
My wife is in fashion design, and she made the observation a week ago. She said, 4 years ago, it was Russian fashion designers in awe of the West, and it was hard to compete with them. She said, the Russians only compete with Russians now. They don't care about the West.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
It has happened. That is remarkable change because you both know the Westerners and the Slavophiles, the debate that's over 100 years old in Russia. That is Western aggression in a Western Russophobia has kind of decided that debate.
Yeah.
What do you think? On Sunday we had this interesting election in Japan. What do you think the Russians are making out of Japan? On the one hand, it's in the Western camp. On the other hand, it's kind of it's a different thing. And I made this kind of prediction that Japan is now under a lot of systemic pressure to actually maybe do a rapprochement with Russia just for the sake of getting its hands on these on the oil and gas that they have been working on. Do you think Russia views Japan in a different way?
Russia plays the long game with Japan, a very, very long game. Yes, it would like a rapprochement, absolutely. But you can tell us better about the dynamics of Japanese domestic politics. But the United States is a very erratic and very unreliable and reflexively aggressive, and so I would, for the Japanese. I would, make Japan great again, and have much more of a regional approach. We're working with South Korea, a rapprochement somehow in the cards with North Korea, and with China. Okay, that East Asia has natural markets for itself. I mean, the United States over exaggerates its importance. It's a pieces on the board. It's the military, of course, but in every other respect, it becomes less and less and less. These Trump people, well, it's interesting. They overplayed their hand in the beginning, at the very beginning of the second Trump administration. Over the last few weeks, we see this kind of shift. I can't interpret what's going on right now, but uh, Japan is in a pivotal position, and I think it should. I don't want to see Japan as a nuclear power. No, it gets really crowded in Asia with China, Russia, North Korea, and then Japan. Enough in this neighborhood here. But like I said, Russia has a very long game with Japan, and it would like a rapprochement.
John?
Well, I'm not really qualified to answer, but I imagine that they will take into consideration two more or less immovable factors. One is, of course, the presence of American troops in Japan, and the other is the relationship with China, which is obviously a massive priority for Russia at the moment. And I think any rapprochement with Japan would have to be coordinated with Peking. But beyond that, I don't really have, it's not something I know really enough about.
It's just interesting, like, because Russia has so many. I mean, it is so huge, and it has so many interests on so many sides. And this is one of the things that the Europeans often forget, right? Russia has a whole, like, the Far East and everything. And
Yeah, but see, Pascal, one of the things that's I think misunderstood or not understood well enough, Russia fundamentally is a status quo power. It wants
Yeah.
to keep what it has.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
People have criticized, commented on why Russia wants to take over Ukraine. No, it doesn't. Okay, though it feels a very strong moral obligation because how the Soviet Union collapsed, in which millions of Russians found themselves in different countries. Now that is a sensitive issue here. I want our viewers to understand from 2014 to 2022. Putin was severely criticized in the Donbass, and where other areas were Russian majority. I mean, I've seen documentaries where he's lambasted, okay,
Yeah.
because the perception at that time was Russia's meddling in Ukraine, and the Russians are saying Russia isn't meddling enough in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And he really took, and he's admitted. His administration has admitted that they miscalculated a number of times from the Orange Revolution all the way up to the Maidan coup. So that it's been a long corrective policy and a politics too, because I would always remind people before the special military operation. See, Pascal, John, did you see images and videos on a daily basis of how the people of the Donbass were slaughtered by the Kiev regime? No, you
Of course
didn't. I
not.
did.
Of course not. There was no transmission.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes,
you did.
I saw
But
it.
that's like in all these conflicts, Peter. It was the same in the Syrian civil war from 2011 onwards. We never saw any images in Western media of the exactions carried out, the horrible murders and so on carried out by the Syrian Islamists until the proclamation, by the way, of the Islamic State. That changed things, but that was later. That was in 2014, and yet those images were being shown on Russian television all the time. And similarly, we never, as you say, ever saw anything from the Donbass. And by the way, the journalists there's a French girl and there's a German girl who have who lived there or something and made documentaries about it. They've been sanctioned, because the information and the images and so on are forbidden.
Yeah, because in the newsroom where we would be showing these videos, people would say, "I have family in that village.
Of course, yeah.
They
Exactly.
dress the same. They have the same religion. They eat the same diet, eat the same foliage, the same kind of trees." And that's what that created a lot of attention with the authorities, so even
Yes.
broadly across Russian society. Russia is not a monolithic place, hardly. Okay, and so it is the eastern Ukraine, Crimea. Well, Crimea is Russia, but that is it's not the near abroad. It's a domestic issue, and that's something that's never been explained to Western audiences.
Yeah.
My friends, I do have to wind it down. We are nearing the hour, but this was fascinating. I'm really happy that we can do this. And what you said at the beginning, it's fascinating to just ask people things and then see where a discussion takes you and what kind of insights you get.
Pascal, I want to ask you, are you from Japan, or you moved to Japan? You work in Japan?
I moved to Japan 10 years ago for my PhD and stayed.
Why?
Because even 10 years before that, in 2004, I went there for a high school exchange, and I really liked it. I've been in touch with Japan for 20 years, over 20 years now, and it's a good place. It's a good place with good people, and Switzerland's good too. But Japan is more fascinating.
Well, I asked you a question that many people wanted me to ask you, and I just
really. Well, thank you very much. Thank you also for the public thinking and the distribution. I think it's really important. Everybody, please check out Peter Lavelle and John Laughland also on their channels, and I will put links into the description. Also, I know you're on the Gaggle with
George Samueli.
George Samueli. All of those are very important podcasts. And
everybody subscribe to Neutrality Study. It's a must-watch channel.
Yes.
Must watch it.
Robbing each other's bags. Thank you, my friends. See you soon.
Okay, Pascal. Thanks a lot. Right here. Bye.